Welcome to the Waterloo podcast. My name is Martin Aaron. Since the year 2000, I've been building a database of the British Army at Waterloo. By compiling original records from the Public Record Office and regimental archives, I've gathered information about each of the 33,000 British combatants in 1815. This podcast series examines that data. Hello and welcome to episode 34. Today we're looking at one of the most famous regiments from the Napoleonic Wars and from the British Army in general, the Black Watch. At this time properly titled the 42nd Royal Highland Foot, they were the second of the three kilted Highland regiments in action in 1815. We've talked about the 79th, the Cameron Highlanders, in episode 8, and now is the turn of the men in the government tartan and the red hackle, their distinctive red feathers in their bonnets. Let's get started straight away with finding out where the men of the Black Watch were from. And while we might have been surprised in the last episode to discover the relative lack of Scotsmen in the first foot, the Royal Scots, as you can see, that is very much not the case here. Of the 612 other ranks, 583 have birthplace data, so 95%, and we can see 521 Scots, 45 Irish, just 15 English and 2 foreigners. And I should add, virtually all of the officers in this regiment were also Scotsmen. In terms of counties, there was quite a broad spread with men from most corners of Scotland, but the most common areas of recruitment are listed here. And we can see from this map of the top 5 counties that they really were Highlanders. Perthshire was in 5th place, Sutherland and Aberdeenshire next, then quite a way out in front in 2nd place is Roche, what is now Ross and Cromarty, and number 1 Inverness shire. The town of Inverness was unsurprisingly the main supplier from that county, while Dingwall supplied the most men from Ross. For age, there's a date of birth for 421 of the other ranks, so 69%, and it shows that 1784 was the most common birth date, 31 years old in 1815, while there's a mean of 1786, so age 29. The oldest man for whom there's a record is Private Donald Morrison from Far, Sutherland, born in 1766 and thus 49 years old in 1815, while the youngest was William Berkeley from Alva, Banffshire, aged just 16. Now for enlistment there's data for 530 of the men, so 87%, and we can see here that the most common year of enlistment was 1811, but the mean was 1807, so that's 8 years service before Waterloo. And as we saw with the Royal Scots last time, even those men who'd enlisted in late 1814, early 1815, were not necessarily the inexperienced raw recruits we might assume them to be. Private Alexander Muckle, for example, enlisted in January 1815, but had actually previously served in the Royal Artillery from 1807. While William Blaney, who enlisted just 7 months before Waterloo in December 1814, had served 8 years in the 36th Foot, fighting through most of the major engagements of the Peninsular War. And there are dozens of men with similarly lengthy experience prior to joining the 42nd. Indeed, I don't have the exact numbers yet, but probably a majority had also served in the Fencibles between the years 1798 or 99 to summer 1802. These were volunteer regiments, a kind of home guard, formed in the 1790s in response to the threat of invasion. You can see here the most common units in which the Black Watch men had served. There's the Clan Alpine Fencibles, many men served in that unit, the Ross and Cromarty Fencibles, the Caithness Legion Fencible Cavalry, the Breadalbane Fencibles, Princess Charlotte of Wales's Fencibles, again a lot from there, and the Duke of York's Fencibles, and many other Fencible regiments. It's hardly any wonder, then, that the Black Watch would prove in the Peninsular War to be such an elite fighting force. Most men had not only served 6 or 7 years before their first major battle at Corunna in January 1809, but had also done those prior 3 or 4 years soldiering in the Fencibles. There were even a handful of men at Waterloo who'd served in Egypt and fought at the Battle of Alexandria back in 1801. To understand the 42nd's history of fighting in the Peninsula, we need to first know that the regiment had 2 battalions during this period, and that they both served in different stages of the war. Once again, I'm very grateful for the superb work of Steve Brown, whose very helpful page here on the Napoleon series lays out the various postings very clearly. We can see the 1st Battalion served at Corunna and all of that campaign, then returned in 1812 and was present at Salamanca, Burgos, Vitoria, Nivelles, Nimes, Orthez and Toulouse, while the 2nd Battalion arrived in 1810 and saw action at Busaco that year, Fuentes de Nor in 1811, and Ciudad Rodrigo and Badajoz in 1812. At this point, the battalion returned to England, but fit men stayed and were transferred into the recently arrived 1st Battalion. More men were transferred over when the 2nd Battalion was disbanded in the Peace of 1814. And this explains why, at Waterloo the following year, you had a mix of veterans from both battalions, between them present for pretty much every shot fired in anger in Portugal, Spain and southern France. In the last episode, we learnt that an incredible number of the Royal Scots at Waterloo bore the scars and old wounds of that regiment's failed assault on the town of San Sebastian, the 25th of July, 1813. Well, the Black Watch had suffered a similar experience at Burgos on the 19th of September 1812, another night attack which failed and resulted in catastrophic casualties. The 42nd was unfortunate enough to suffer this kind of slaughter a second time in the final action of the war at Toulouse in April 1814. Many more men at Waterloo bore the scars of that futile conflict, the news of peace coming too late to prevent this needless catastrophe. If we take just one company of the Black Watch at Waterloo at random as an example, this is number 4 company, we can see just how many men had been wounded at either Burgos or Toulouse, or both. Those men listed in red here indicates they were also wounded at Waterloo. So this is just a random sample. The other companies contain similar numbers of men wounded in these 2 actions. What else do we know about the men in the Red Hackle? The ranks of the Black Watch were unusually literate for the British Army of this period, although possibly not so for Scotsmen, as we've already discussed in our episode on the Scots Greys, much higher levels of literacy amongst the Scottish troops. The men were also small in stature. Like the first foot last week, 5'6" would probably be the average height, or maybe even 5'5". The regiment comprised 612 other ranks with around 30 combatant officers. They were commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Sir Robert Macara, with Major Robert Dick second in command. Let's now join them in Flanders in 1815. Having set off from Brussels in the small hours of the 16th of June, Pax Brigade arrived at Quatre Bras sometime around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. If we look at this photo here, we're looking southwards with the crossroads of Quatre Bras just here to the left, and then the Namur Road here and Charleroi Road here. This sheep farm in the centre is named La Bergerie. Captain John Campbell describes their arrival at the crossroads.
When the 42nd first halted on the road from Brussels, it was close to some houses on the left. We moved forward and soon after turned off to the left and formed line.
We know from the previous episode that the 4th Regiment of Pax Brigade, the 1st Foot, had already been detached and sent forward, where they were paired with the 28th North Gloucestershire Foot of Kemp's Brigade. This left the Black Watch, the 92nd, the Gordons, and the 44th East Essex Foot, who were hurried down the Namur Road and formed up along it. The Gordons remained in position here, but the 42nd and 44th were pushed forward into the fields of tall crops in the triangle of land between the Namur Road and the Charleroi Road. It's hard to know for certain just how far forward they went, but certainly south of the farmhouse. Sergeant James Anton describes eventually being about 2 furlongs south of Quatre Bras, which is about 400 metres. He describes how the regiment left the crossroads and marched into fields of towering crops.
We halted on the road formed in line, fronting a bank on the right side, while other regiments took up their position to the right and left, as directed by our general. A luxuriant crop of grain hid from our view the contending skirmishes beyond, and presented a considerable obstacle to our advance.
What happened next would be one of the most terrifying and catastrophic events ever experienced, even by this battle-hardened and scarred battalion of Peninsular veterans. In a masterpiece of understatement, all that Captain Campbell says in a later letter is,
Soon after, we were attacked by cavalry. We formed square and had some fighting.
This falls quite short of properly describing the mayhem that ensued. Sergeant Alexander McQueen gives a more detailed account of events. He relates how the Black Watch's skirmishers were out in front when
Lancers appeared, approaching quietly as if reconnoitring.
Then suddenly a large body of Lancers came racing pell-mell past their right. Many of the old Peninsular veterans recognised these Lancers as their allies, Brunswick troops, in their distinctive black uniforms. However, what many did not realise was that these Brunswick cavalry were being pursued by French Lancers. Sergeant Anton perfectly describes the blasé, relaxed manner in which he and many of the other men watched the mass of cavalry coming on.
We saw their approach at a distance as they issued from a wood, and took them for Brunswickers. They were approaching our right flank, from which our skirmishes were extended, and we were far from being in a formation fit to repel an attack. I think we stood with too much confidence, gazing towards them as if they had been our friends, anticipating the gallant charge they would make on our flying foe. We were making no preparative movement to receive them as enemies, further than reloading of the muskets, until a German orderly dragoon galloped up exclaiming, "Francis, Francis!" Wheeling about, galloped off. We instantly formed a rallying square. No time for particularity. Every man's piece was loaded, and our enemies approached at full charge. The feet of their horses seemed to tear up the ground.
Sergeant McEwen was one of those who had realised what was happening and had tried to alert his commanding officer to the fact that the pursuing force were French. He was overruled, the officer insisting that the Lancers must be Allied troops. The grave consequences of this error were soon to become apparent.
The skirmishers ran in with the cry, "Square! Square! French cavalry!" The Lancers overtook 2 companies in the act of completing square. Several of the 42nd were cut off, but a portion of the Lancers became hemmed inside the square by the remainder of those 2 companies and were instantly bayoneted.
This line from Sergeant McEwen about the French Lancers being hemmed in inside the 42nd square and instantly bayoneted has often been repeated in histories of the battle. It suggests the Black Watch were initially caught out, but soon restored order and regained the upper hand. This is not reflected in the horrendous casualties the regiment suffered at this point. The number of killed and wounded and the number of sabre and lance wounds suggests the regiment was largely overrun and did well to not completely collapse and flee to the rear. Sergeant Anton describes the fearful consequences of the initial mistake.
Our skirmishers, having been impressed with the same opinion that these were Brunswick cavalry, fell beneath their lances, and few escaped death or wounds. Our brave colonel fell at this time, pierced through the chin until the point of the lance reached the brain. Captain Menzies fell, covered with wounds, and a momentary conflict took place over him. The grenadiers whom he commanded pressed round to save and avenge him, but fell beneath the enemy's lances.
With Lieutenant Colonel Sir Robert Macara killed, command fell to Major Robert Dick, who was himself then severely wounded. Captain George Davidson took over, but he too was mortally wounded, leaving Captain John Campbell to take over, the 4th man to take command probably in as many minutes. Eventually, the French Lancers retired, and the bloody and bruised remnants of the battalion managed to form up and reorganise. The 44th East Essex Foot had suffered similarly in being caught out of formation. It seems that the 2 battered battalions now amalgamated to form one combined square. This was achieved just in time to repel a new attack of French cavalry, this time of cuirassiers, who, according to Anton, had just annihilated the 69th South Lincolnshire Foot, further to the west, outside the Bosso Wood.
Our last file had got into square, and into its proper place, so far as unequalised companies could form a square, when the cuirassiers dashed full on two of its faces. Their heavy horses and steel armour seemed sufficient to bury us under them had they been pushed forward on our bayonets.
General Dennis Pack himself was inside this combined square and raised his hat. The men of the Black Watch took this as an order to fire. Anton's account is brilliantly evocative.
A most destructive fire was opened. Riders, cased in heavy armour, fell tumbling from their horses. The horses reared, plunged and fell on the dismounted riders. Steel helmets and cuirasses rung against unsheathed sabres as they fell to the ground. Shrieks and groans of men, the neighing of horses and the discharge of musketry rent the air, as men and horses mixed together in one heap of indiscriminate slaughter. Those who were able to fly fled towards a wood on our right, whence they had issued the attack.
Sergeant McEwen recalls an interesting detail. The men at first baffled as to why their shots were not bringing down some of the enemy.
The French cavalry wore blue cloaks. The 42nd had observed that the only effect on them by their fire was to make the French dragoons reel back a little in their saddles. A cry was raised. "They're in armour! Fire at their horses!"
For the rest of the day, the combined square deployed into line to engage with French infantry and then back into square, depending on the level of perceived cavalry threat. In between, the battalion came under a crippling fire from French skirmishers and artillery. Eventually, this half of the brigade moved back to attain some cover. Captain Campbell writes,
After we retired in square, still followed by the cavalry, we halted close to a large farmhouse with a wall round it, and were ordered to lay down.
Presumably, this was the farmhouse of La Bergerie. Lieutenant John Malcolm writes,
During the remainder of the day we were repeatedly attacked by infantry in the front and cavalry in the rear. Notwithstanding, we kept our ground until about 7 o'clock, when we were ordered to retire to the place from which we advanced first.
Looking at the huge numbers of casualties from the 16th of June, it's hard to see how the 42nd can have mustered more than between 100 or 200 all ranks on the following morning. Indeed, an anonymous letter from a soldier in the Black Watch published in a Scottish newspaper in July 1815 states,
Our fine brigade, which entered the field on that eventful day, consisting of the 3rd Battalion Royal Scots, the 42nd, the 44th and the 92nd Regiments, are now formed into one battalion, not exceeding in whole 400 men.
In episode 7 of this series, we heard that the 32nd Foot in Kemp's Brigade were forced on the 18th of June to adopt an impromptu formation of 6 divisions rather than the usual 10 companies. So great had their casualties been. And it's a fair assumption that many, if not all of the battalions of both Kempt and Pack's brigades found it necessary to do something similar. Indeed, Sergeant Anton's account of the 17th of June mentions cooking breakfast after arranging our ranks and equalising our companies, which sounds as if some significant reorganisation was required, some companies suffering more severely than others, and some companies having lost all or nearly all their officers and NCOs. Of around 30 combatant officers, possibly fewer, we can't know how many were in the rear with baggage, etc., 23 were killed or wounded at Quatre Bras, including all but one of the 10 company commanders. It's difficult to imagine then what state the regiment was in when it rose the following morning, the 17th of June. This day was spent withdrawing through Genappe to the position at Waterloo. As we've heard previously, to add to the gloomy mood, the weather was remarkably bad, with lashing rain and a ferocious thunderstorm. Lightning flashed across the grey skies. Pack's brigade finally arrived at their position at Waterloo and lay down to try to sleep in the torrential rain and lightning. And though some men were exhausted enough that they did somehow manage to sleep in this downpour, there was then the unwelcome interruption of a false alarm which had the whole brigade up and at the ready. Sergeant Anton tells us,
At this time, a very heavy shower poured down upon us, and occasioned some movement or noisy murmuring in the French army or line of Belgians. This induced our sentries to give an alarm. In an instant, each man of the brigade stood by his musket. The bayonets were already in the pieces, and all these loaded, notwithstanding the rain. We stood thus to our arms for nearly an hour, sinking to our ankles amongst the soft, muddy soil of the field. When the alarm was found to be false, we again sat or laid down to repose.
On the 18th of June, we know very little about the experience of the Black Watch. Unsurprisingly, with so many casualties among the officers at Quatre Bras, there are virtually no accounts of the 18th of June available. It's likely that they, along with the 44th East Essex Foot, were in such a forlorn state and so lacking in officers that they could not be expected to play much part in the imminent action, and that both regiments were withdrawn from the front line, perhaps still amalgamated as one unit, and kept a little way to the rear in reserve. This is supported by Captain Gordon of the 1st Foot, the Royal Scots, whose account we heard in the last episode. He describes looking round and seeing the 42nd in column considerably to his rear, recognising them by the red feathers in their bonnets. The suggestion that the 42nd were barely engaged on the 18th of June is also supported by lines from Sergeant Anton, who wrote,
The loss of a regiment this day was trifling, if compared with that which is sustained on the 16th at Quatre Bras. We had only 6 men killed, 1 captain, 3 lieutenants, and 33 rank and file wounded.
One can presume that these few casualties came mostly from the incessant French artillery fire, which is mentioned by Captain Campbell. This famous painting by the French artist Henri Philippoteau shows Highlanders in square at Waterloo valiantly repelling the French cuirassiers. In his letter to Siborne, Captain Campbell doesn't mention ever forming square or indeed ever coming into contact with the enemy on the 18th of June. He merely describes twice moving in column to the right, then back again to their original position, all the time under the fire of the French artillery. So this is a marvellous painting, but it's probably a more accurate depiction of Quatre Bras on the 16th of June. Curiously, if you look closely, you'll notice that the side of the square facing away in the background here are wearing shakos, not Highland bonnets, so this does seem actually to show a combined square. The 44th East Essex and Black Watch, surely. Let's now look at some statistics and hear about some of the men of each of the 10 companies. It would be fascinating to know which were the 2 companies mentioned earlier by Sergeant McEwen that were overwhelmed while trying to form square. So let's see if we can have a stab at identifying them here. Now I've added a nominal strength here, which we probably always deduct 10 to 15% from, but it gives some idea of the percentage casualties. So number 1 company, 33% casualties. This company's commander, Captain George Davidson, was killed at Quatre Bras, and all 5 men killed in their ranks also lost their lives there. And we'll see that this is pretty much the case across all 10 companies. In 1809, Sergeant John Shaw of this company, an Inverness man, had been sergeant of the party that carried Sir John Moore from the battlefield at Corunna. Number 2 company, 46% casualties. This company was commanded by Captain John Campbell, whose account we heard earlier. He took command of the whole regiment after all his senior officers had fallen. Private Thomas Little of this company received lance wounds to his lower leg and thigh at Quatre Bras. Just 20 years old, he was discharged the following year due to these wounds. Number 3 company, 31% casualties. Sergeant Anton mentions in his account that 6 privates of the regiment were captured by the French at Quatre Bras. He relates the story that one of these prisoners, a diminutive young lad by the name of Smith Fife, was scoffed at by a French general who picked him up by the scruff of the neck, holding him up and saying to his men something along the lines of, "Look at the quality of what we're up against." Anton goes on to say that Private Fife returned a few days later wearing the uniform of a French grenadier, and was consequently known as Napoleon by the rest of the regiment from that point on. Private Andrew Harper seems to have been another colourful character from this company. From Lerwick in Shetland, He was one of the newer recruits and only 21 years old. He survived the battle, but would later get himself court-martialed 7 times due to his love of the bottle. His discharge papers relate that his general conduct as a drunkard has been bad, in other aspects a clean and obedient soldier. Number 4 Company, 56% casualties. This company was commanded by Captain Robert Boyle, who fell wounded at Quatre Bras. Private John Sutherland from Clyne in Sutherland must have been among those men fleeing through the tall crops, trying to escape the slicing cuts of the French cavalry. He received sabre wounds on the back of his head, above the right eye, and on his leg. Number 5 Company, 39% casualties. We heard earlier the account of Sergeant James Anton of this company. By the 17th of June, he was the only surviving man with 3 stripes, all 3 of his fellow sergeants having fallen at Quatre Bras. Robert May and Donald McGrigor wounded, and John McCole from the Isle of Mull killed. Another islander from the Inner Hebrides was Private John Adge from the Isle of Jura. He suffered a severe wound on the buttocks and upper thigh, as seen in the surgeon's sketch here. He was treated in a Falcon hospital in Brussels and survived. Number 6 Company, 62% casualties. This company lost the most fatalities, with 10 men killed or died of wounds, and unusually 4 of these 10 were killed at Waterloo on the 18th of June. Perhaps a cannonball had struck their position. All of the company's corporals were casualties, 1 killed, 1 died of wounds, and the remaining 2 wounded. Private John McDougall of this company, a Glasgow man, seems to have been plagued by misfortune. In the retreat to Corunna, he was severely wounded in the head on the 9th of June 1809 and captured. He spent the ensuing years in Saint-Louis prison in France, presumably passing all 5 years of the Peninsular War behind bars until the peace of 1814. Returning to the regiment, he managed to survive Quatre Bras, only to be hit by lightning during the terrible thunderstorms of the 17th of June. He survived, but lost the sight of his left eye. Incredibly, he fell in on the 18th of June at Waterloo, presumably somewhat charred, only to be wounded in the chest and knee. Number 7 Company. With 63% casualties overall, this company suffered the worst in the regiment, a truly horrific number. And if we consider men absent with the baggage and those who carried the wounded to the rear, there can't realistically have been a company left to fight in the ensuing days. The men's wounds also paint a terrible picture of being overrun by cavalry at Quatre Bras. Sergeant Alexander MacLeod from Inverness received a sabre cut on the head. Private Alexander Morrison from Elgin, a sabre cut to the thigh. And those who survived the initial cavalry onslaught were then subject to withering artillery and musket fire. Private John Beattie of this company, aged 38, from Dumfries, was sketched by a surgeon at the Annonciate Hospital in Brussels with the accompanying note.
A splinter of a shell struck him over the right eye. He has also a compound fracture of the left leg, the bones of which were splintered by a musket ball.
Private Beattie survived his wounds, but they led to his discharge the following year. Number 8 Company, 46% casualties. There's no indication of which day 2 of the casualties in this company were wounded, but for the rest, every single one is listed as being wounded at Quatre Bras, all of the killed and all 18 of the remaining wounded. Again, it's hard to see how this company could have functioned with just a handful of men left by the 18th of June. Private William Donald, aged 27, from Aberdeen, had previously been wounded in the assaults of both Burgos and Toulouse, and now, at Quatre Bras, he picked up the hat-trick, this time being wounded by a lance in the back. Number 9 Company, 41% casualties. This company was commanded by Captain Daniel Mackintosh, who, by now it's probably needless to say, was wounded at Quatre Bras. Private William Bankier from Kilsyth was one of those men who'd served in both battalions in the Peninsula, and thus campaigned through the whole war, from Busaco in 1810 to Toulouse in 1814. He was shot in the face in this final battle at Toulouse, and at Quatre Bras was wounded again, this time a sabre wound to the right side of his head. And finally, number 10 Company, 35% casualties. I mentioned earlier the various service many of the men had done prior to joining the Black Watch. Well, Private Andrew Gilmore of this company was one of the very few men in the British Army at Waterloo, perhaps even unique, to have served in the Royal Navy. From Falkirk, he'd served 7 years, from 1795 to 1802. He then enlisted in the Black Watch in 1806 and gone through the Corunna campaign, being wounded in the knee at the village of Elvina. He returned to the Peninsula in 1812 and saw further action at Salamanca, the Pyrenees, Nivelles, Nives and Toulouse. Quite a life. So in total, that's 58 men killed or died of wounds, with a staggering 222 wounded, 46% casualties overall. Looking at the stats of these 10 companies, the best guess would be that numbers 6 and 7 companies were the two caught worst by the French lancers. But the fact that there were sabre and lance wounds across almost all of the companies, again suggests that the devastation occurred across the whole regiment, rather than merely being restricted to just 2 companies. So I think the key thing I've learnt from this study of the Black Watch is that Quatre Bras was far more costly to the regiment than I'd previously grasped. My prior understanding of Quatre Bras had been that the inexperienced 33rd and 69th were caught in the tall crops and massacred by the French cavalry before they could form square, while the veteran Black Watch, while similarly caught out of formation, were able to improvise on the spot and avoid serious casualties. As I said earlier, that line published in Siborne from Sergeant McEwen about the square forming with French cavalry hemmed inside and then all being quickly bayoneted is the source for this impression, and has been repeated in countless histories of the battle ever since. However, if we look at the casualties for the Black Watch, they're certainly comparable to those regiments of Halkett's Brigade, the 33rd and 69th. Indeed, some companies fared even worse. And that's a new understanding for me. The slaughter of the British infantry at Quatre Bras at the hands of French cavalry was not limited to the west of the Charleroi Road. And for the 42nd and 44th at least, Pack's brigade suffered as severely as Halkett's. As part of the Army of Occupation, the Black Watch was stationed first at Saint-Denis and then at Valenciennes, but their stay lasted only 6 months. In December 1815, they marched to Calais, sailing for Dover on the 17th. From Dover, the regiment marched to Chelmsford, and then, on the 16th of January, set off to march the 270 miles to Sunderland. Sergeant Anton describes the country being in a kind of Waterloo fever in this period, and being greeted by cheering crowds at every town through which they passed on their march. At Cambridge, for example, the men were welcome to explore the university buildings, and each man given a donation equivalent to 2 days' pay. Similar warm welcomes and donations were met at every other town, and the men found themselves treated to drink and tobacco in whatever tavern they visited. The high life continued in Edinburgh, the regiment's next stop, and only died down towards the second half of 1816 when, as we've heard in many previous episodes, civil unrest began to flare up across the British Isles and the mood nationally turned sour. In September 1816, the regiment was sent to Glasgow to try to police growing social protests in that city. From there, in 1817, they sailed for Ireland, where they would spend the next 8 years moving regularly around the country, usually to stifle the latest outbreak of public disorder. The regiment seemed to produce exceedingly high-calibre NCOs, some leaving the regiment in these years to become barrack sergeants at various depots around the British Isles, while at least 3 men from the ranks at Waterloo would later be commissioned. Among these was Colour Sergeant William Duff from Banff, who survived being part of No. 7 Company, rising to become Battalion Sergeant Major, and was then commissioned as the regimental adjutant. In 1825, the regiment was posted to Gibraltar, the beginning of 10 years in the Mediterranean. The first 7 were spent on the Rock, the only major event being a pandemic which broke out in 1828. According to Sergeant Anton, 54 men of the Black Watch died in this sickness, and among these I've recorded at least 7 Waterloo men. As well as this outbreak, it's noticeable that the regiment seems to have been unusually struck down by consumption, what's now called tuberculosis. A contagious disease, one can only wonder how it entered the ranks of the regiment, but it seems to have spread and caused the discharge of many good men between 1818 and 1820. In 1832, the regiment was moved to Malta, then Corfu, returning to Britain in 1835. By this time, 20 years after the battle, there were only a handful of Waterloo men in the regiment. But incredibly, one man, Private Duncan Cameron, was to serve another 10 years, although no longer in the Black Watch. From Kiltarlety, Inverness, he joined the regiment in 1814, aged 18. At Quatre Bras, he was wounded in the mouth and nose, and discharged in 1821, having completed his period of service. However, just 18 days later, he re-enlisted into the 3rd Foot Guards and served for another 24 years. He was eventually discharged in 1845, one of the very last Waterloo men in the ranks, still serving in the British Army. And who were the last men standing? Well, these tough old veterans did seem to last, and there were several men who lived on into their 80s and beyond. Among the last Waterloo men of the Black Watch was Private Smith Fife, aka Napoleon, the lad captured, picked up and shaken by the French general after Quatre Bras. Originally from Ulrig in Caithness, he married a girl from Kippen in Stirlingshire and settled down in that village, living at 11 Castle Hill. He died there in 1872, aged 85. 3 years later, in March 1875, saw the passing of Private David Morrison from No. 6 Company. The Edinburgh Evening News reporting,
Death of a Black Watch veteran. David Morrison, a Waterloo veteran, died on Saturday last at the residence of his daughter at Kinning Street, Glasgow. He was born in Stirling in the year 1785, and he had therefore attained his 90th year. Old Davy, as he was called, enjoyed a pension of 1 shilling 7 pence per day, which he lifted quarterly. In going to the barracks for his pension, he was in the habit of walking up to George Square to take a look at the statue of his old general, Sir John Moore, and he always uncovered his head when he inspected the monument. He retained to the last clear recollection of the events of his early life, and delighted in conversation to fight his old battles over again.
Another interesting character was Private Robert Roycroft. From Carlow in Ireland, he was only 18 at Waterloo, and served in the regiment until 1839, when he was discharged with a pension. 8 years later, he decided to try his luck on the other side of the world, and emigrated to New Zealand, setting up as a gold prospector at the Thames goldfield. He must have been quite a well-known character locally. A newspaper reported,
Roycroft is a remarkably hale man for his years, and when the pensions were last paid, walked from Punga Flat to Shortland to draw his.
He died in October 1875, aged 78. The last of the officers seems to have been John Orr, a lieutenant at Waterloo, where he was severely wounded in the knee. He later became superintendent at the Scottish Naval and Military Academy, a position he held for 30 years. He died in Edinburgh in 1779, aged around 89. There's a book about his life, which sadly I only just came across as I was finishing off this episode, so haven't managed to read it yet, but I do intend to. But almost certainly the last Waterloo man in the Black Watch, and maybe even the whole British Army, was Private John Mackay, who was only awarded a pension in 1875, listed as having no wife or family, and living at 74 Kirk Street, Peterhead, Aberdeenshire. 2 years later, he was admitted as an inn pensioner at Chelsea Hospital in London, where he lived extraordinarily for another 9 years, dying in 1886. You can see on his Chelsea record here a clerk has added in blue pencil that John Mackay was 101 years old. He featured here in this famous photo of elderly Chelsea pensioners from the Napoleonic Wars. He's top left here, with a quite superb beard. So that brings this episode on the Black Watch to an end. I hope you found it interesting. Many thanks, as always, to the kind volunteers who do such a great job reading the extracts for this podcast. As many of you have noted in the comments, their generous contributions really add to these episodes. If only there were a way to thank them, I hear you say. Well, now there is. There's a link below to buy me a coffee, and if you've enjoyed this episode or any of the previous episodes in this series, go there, buy me a drink, and I'll pass on everything to the kind volunteers in the form of something bottle-shaped. Special thanks this week to Major Ronnie Proctor, ex of the Black Watch, who read the lines of Captain Campbell. Superb as always to have that connection to the regiment. Next week, the third part of Pack's Brigade, the 44th East Essex Foot. But until then, thank you very much for watching.